So today, as I mentioned, we're back in Matthew chapter 8, and we'll be going through the end of the chapter. But as we pick up in chapter 8, we see that Jesus decided to leave the large crowds for a while and go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And in verse 18, where we pick up, we read this. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. And so before Jesus could get into the boat and depart, there were two men that approached him. And that's where we're going to pick up this morning. We're going to begin by calling this choices. In verse 18, Jesus gave orders to go to the other side of the sea, but as I mentioned, the two men approached him. Verse 19, we read about the first man. When a scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Now, we need some information about who this guy was, and we can gain a few things just by knowing some things about scribes in the day. Scribes had knowledge of the law, and they could draft legal documents. And generally speaking, there was one scribe in each of the towns in Israel at the time. They could handle documents dealing with marriage, divorce, loans, inheritance, sale of land, and things like that. But many of the scribes, in addition to that, were also Pharisees. And that made them experts in the Mosaic law. And the reality is, especially as Jesus continued in his ministry, the scribes were some of Jesus' biggest adversaries because, quite frankly, they disagreed with him about the Mosaic law and how he was explaining the Mosaic law and how he was interpreting it, you might say. So this scribe, what is interesting is that he is identified as a scribe. And when he speaks to Jesus, he addresses him as teacher. And that in and of itself would say that this man was a little bit different than the other scribes. This scribe went against most of the scribes and admitted that Jesus was a teacher. And so that's interesting. And many criticize this man. And they say that, well, he really wasn't serious. But the fact is, if you look at what we read in this text and in Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel, it just doesn't really indicate that he wasn't serious. The text did not say whether he followed Jesus or not. That's one of the things that people have kind of interpreted over the years and read into the text. But it really doesn't say one way or another what he actually did. He just told Jesus that he was going to follow him. Now, verse 20 continues. Jesus said to him, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And so Jesus is in essence warning the scribe that a decision to follow him was not going to be easy. Why? They live in Israel. They live under the Jewish control. They live under a world where the religious leaders control things. And as we know, because we've read the Gospels, they would oppose Jesus. And so really what this man is saying is that, you know what? I just want you to be informed that if you decide to follow me wherever I go, you might have trouble. As a scribe, you might have trouble. And so Jesus is letting this man know right up front that that decision may be a serious one for him. But what I want to emphasize again, there is no indication one way or another how the man responded to Jesus' statement. We kind of read into it and we say, oh, he just wasn't really serious. And then he walked away. But we just don't know that. It is important to note the phrase that Jesus used to describe himself, Son of Man. And what we know is that the phrase Son of Man was the name that Jesus used most often to describe himself. More than any other phrase to describe himself, he used this phrase more often than not. And so then with that fact, the question is, well, why was this important? Why would Matthew want to highlight this in his gospel to the Jewish people? Well, the fact is, Son of Man was a messianic title. We find that in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. And it was specifically a reference to the humanity of the Messiah. So what is Matthew emphasizing here? That yes, Jesus is the Messiah, but He's also a man. He's also human. And we know as we look back at this that of course Jesus was a man. He was human. It was His incarnation. But we also know that He was God. And by the way, we'll see that demonstrated just a little bit further in the chapter. But Daniel wrote this: I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, that's a reference to God, and presented himself before Him. It continues on. And to Him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, and that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve Him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. By the way, that was particularly important in Daniel's day, because Israel had been overrun a number of times by now. The Assyrians took away the northern kingdom, and now under the Babylonians, they have taken away the southern kingdom as well. And this is a reference to the Messiah, and He's referred to as Son of Man. He would be human. But in addition to that, we realize that He's going to be more than human, because His dominion is going to be everlasting. You can't say that about a man, an ordinary man. This is a messianic title. And Matthew is bringing it up because he wants the Jews to know who Jesus is. That He is the Messiah, that He is human, but He is also divine. He is also God. And so the question is, was the man serious about following Jesus? Well, we really don't know. But Jesus wanted this scribe to know that a decision to follow Him would not be easy. It's Israel. And the rejection was coming by whom? The religious leaders. And if he was a scribe and happened to be a Pharisee, he would be going against the religious leaders if he was going to follow Jesus. And so Jesus is just simply giving this man information. You have to make a choice. Are you going to follow me, or are you going to go with the religious leaders and the other scribes and they're going to reject me? What choice are you going to make? So ordinary animals, as Jesus points out, ordinary animals have places to rest their head. Jesus did not. He did not. And again, He's simply wanting this man to know, you're going to have to make a choice, and in the nation in which we live, it's not going to be an easy choice. So verse 21, it continues. Another of the disciples said to Him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. Now I want to point something out immediately from this. This man is identified as one of Jesus' disciples. He's not named. The first man was a scribe. The second man is a disciple of Jesus Christ. But remember something about being a disciple. A disciple simply means a student. And a student could be a believer or an unbeliever. By the way, that's true to this very day. There are people that study the Bible. They're disciples, you could say, of the Scripture. But they reject Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So that tells us something about him, that he is a disciple. He's been wanting to learn more information about Jesus Christ, but we find some additional information about him in his request. Now, to us nowadays, the request seemed reasonable by modern standards. Hey, my dad died. We got a funeral this week. Let me just go and take care of that, and then I will come and follow you. But see, we're looking at it from our perspective. What we have to understand is the perspective in that day. In Israel, the heat could be very extreme. You know what happens to bodies in the heat of the day without taking them to a mortuary or without having them embalmed? Because the Jews weren't doing that. Not like we do today. Well, the body begins to decay quickly. And so, according to Jewish law, according to Jewish standards and beliefs, a person was to be buried within 1 day. 1 day. Again, the heat of Israel at that time would decay the body quickly. But in addition to that, They looked back to the Mosaic Law. In the Mosaic Law, the portion that they looked at was Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23, which talks about a man who is executed by hanging on a tree. And before sundown, the man was supposed to be taken off the tree and buried, even though he was probably a criminal. He was to be buried that very day because someone who was hung on a tree and left there was cursed by God. And so they didn't want that in Israel, so that very day they would take the person down and they would bury them. And that part of the Mosaic Law became the tradition of the day. They were buried that very day. So what is this man talking about? If this man's father had just died, he would have been with the family because they would have been in the process of quickly burying him. So either he's ignoring the family or he's making an excuse as to why he really wasn't going to follow. In addition to the being buried on that day, the Jewish people would have an entire week of mourning. And that person was buried. They would mourn for a week. That would be friends and family. And then they would have the person in the tomb that day. But what they would do as the final process of burial was 1 year. Because what they would do is they would put the person in these carved out areas, and there would be a table that they would lay them on, and they would prepare the body for the burial there in that cave that they carved out. They would then leave the body for 1 year. And on that anniversary, they would go back to the tomb. And the body would have been completely decayed except for the bones. They would gather up the bones and they would put them in what was called an ossuary, or commonly known as a bone box. They would take that bone box and they would put it in little niches that were carved out in this tomb, and they would place them in these little niches where the body would be the final resting place. So when you're talking about burying my father, you're not talking about a short period of time. You're talking about a day, a week, a year. This man's father wasn't dead. He's making an excuse why he's not going to follow Jesus. So whereas the first man's motivation could not be determined by the information, this man's motivation could be determined, and what is he doing? He's making an excuse for not following Jesus. He may be identified as a disciple, but he wasn't a very good one because he's already making excuses. And so Jesus responds. And he says, but Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury the dead. Again, from our point of view today, that looks kind of harsh. Let the dead bury the dead. What is he talking about here? Well, Jesus gave this man a choice to follow me to spiritual life and let the spiritually dead bury the physically dead. That is in essence what Jesus is talking about. Physical death would come to everyone. But spiritual life only came to those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. So once again, he's asking the man to make a choice. What are you going to do? Because Jesus is on a time schedule here, and it's not going to last more than 3 years. So decisions are going to have to be made. And there is no time to put off that decision, to make excuses. So Jesus presented these men with choices. By the way, everyone is presented with choices when it comes to spiritual life. The first man was following Jesus. The question was following Jesus worth the sacrifice that came in a Jewish society that was rejecting Jesus, that would ultimately put him to Pilate to put on a cross? That was the choice he was bringing towards the man. He wanted him to be informed. The second man would need to stop making excuses and genuinely put his faith in Jesus Christ. Once again, it is choices. But I want to point out as well that during this narrative here, Matthew brings up the fact that Jesus is the Messiah in the term that he uses, Son of Man, and that it emphasizes his humanity. That's important for the Jewish people to understand. And so Matthew presents that. Even today, the fact is, choosing to believe in Jesus can have serious consequences. A lot of that depends on where you live in this world. If you live in a Muslim country and you decide to follow Jesus, you are literally taking your life in your hands. There's serious consequences. In this country, there aren't really serious consequences right now. Maybe there will be in the future, who knows? But we live in a free country, so we're free to make choices. But the fact is, we have to make a choice. You can't stand before God in judgment and say, well, I was just waiting for Dad to die. I mean, it's just not going to hold water. You have to decide what you're going to do with Jesus Christ. No genuine excuse will work at judgment. So after speaking to these two men, Jesus then finally gets into the boat and he goes to the other side of Galilee. And the question is really going to come up while he's going there is, who is this guy? Who really is this guy? Verses 23 and 24, it continues. When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was sleeping. Now, if you're me, when you first look at these two sentences here, you go, wait, what? Okay, this boat is on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is not just a little lake. And all of a sudden this storm comes up. You're in the boat with fishermen that are familiar with the Sea of Galilee. And the boat is being tossed about all over the place. The waves are breaking over the boat. Did the water hit Jesus in the face at all? Because you got to think as you're looking at this, why didn't he wake up? Well, to me that just says something about his humanity. He was utterly exhausted. And even though this boat is being tossed about, waves crashing over it, he is still sound asleep. That is, I'm telling you what, that is a deep sleep. You ever wish you could do that? Just get all the cares of the world out of the way and go to sleep. And I don't know, sleep for 8 hours. Does anybody get 8 hours of sleep? I can't remember the last time I got 8 hours of sleep. Let me have some of that deep sleep. So again, this type of storm was actually common. But what was uncommon was that Jesus slept while the boat was being tossed about. That's what is uncommon about this. This was, again, a serious storm, but he had confidence in the fishermen, didn't he? I suppose. So Matthew demonstrated, again, the humanity of Jesus and shows that Jesus was exhausted to the point of sleeping through this violent storm. Verse 25, it continues. And they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." You know, I got to picture this in my mind. It's not like, Jesus, are you awake? No, it's more like, Jesus, are you awake? Look around. We're going to die. We're going to die. Panic. These are the fishermen. We're going to die. But I want to point out that they did have faith in Jesus. They called him Lord. After all, they'd already seen some of the things that he'd already done. Healing people, healing multitudes, casting leprosy or cleansing a leper, healing a centurion's servant from a distance. They'd already seen some of these amazing things. So they had faith in Jesus. They called him Lord. They witnessed the miracles. But the fact is they didn't fully understand who he was. And of course they didn't at this point. They needed more information. Guess what? They're going to get it. They're going to get it. Verse 26, the first part, it says, he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" Really? But it's interesting here, the words, "you men of little faith," are actually one Greek word, and it simply means little faith. You know, they wake Jesus up. We're going to die. We're going to die. And he's looking at them saying, what's wrong with you? So little faith you have. But again, they don't understand who Jesus is. There is no way a storm is going to take his life, because his life is going to end on a cross as a sacrifice for the sin of the world. He's not going to die in a boat drowning. It's not going to happen. Jesus said to them, why are you afraid, little faith? I mean, in my mind, it's like if he was saying it today, he would say to them, why are you afraid, chicken? Don't you get it? And the answer is, no, they didn't get it. They had seen some miracles. That was really amazing. But that was dealing with sickness, disease. This is different. This is a storm. Is he the God that can take care of this? Is he the man that can take care of this? Jesus used the same words, little faith, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he was talking about God's promise to take care of the Jewish people when they believed and followed the Mosaic law. And he said to them, you know what? You just don't have the faith. You don't believe what God promised. You don't believe in God. You're not following the Mosaic law. The problem is you just don't have the faith. In addition to that, he would use those same words to Peter. You know the story when Jesus is walking across the water, they're already in the boat, and they look out and they see Jesus in there. And I'm telling you what, that would have been really weird to see him walking on the water. And you know the story. Peter calls out to him. He goes out to Jesus now walking on the water, and then he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he starts to sink. And what did Jesus say to him? O you of little faith. In addition to that, he said it to the apostles another time, this to the whole group, when he started talking to them about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they look around and they're saying to each other, he must be talking about the fact that we didn't bring enough bread. And Jesus looks at them and says, I'm just adding that part. Oh, you of little faith. But yeah, I mean, I just can't believe he didn't do that so many times with his disciples and then apostles. Oy vey. Now, verse 26, the second part. Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. I thought about Jack, a sailor, and his brother, also a sailor, my father, a sailor. When there's a storm and waves are rolling around, I've seen pictures from my father's cruise books of an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic Ocean where waves are coming over top of the deck of the aircraft carrier. I've seen pictures of him when he was on a destroyer early in his career, and the destroyer is literally going under the water and coming back up. Waves. When a storm stops, the wind may stop, but you know what? The waves don't just stop like that. It takes a while before the sea calms down. Why do I say that? Because what happens here? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. That's not ordinary. That's not an ordinary man to do that. Not only did the wind stop, but the sea immediately became perfectly calm. This is an example of Jesus' amazing power. No ordinary man can do that. It's funny though. Matthew is demonstrating his humanity, and then he turns right around and he talks about the deity of Jesus Christ that can take a storm and with just words make it perfectly calm. But you got to keep in mind, Jesus was the agent of creation. And what did he do in those 6 days? He spoke it, and it appeared. And now he speaks it, and it's calm. And they're amazed. Verse 27. The men were amazed. That's like the understatement of the verse. It's like, no kidding, the men were amazed. and said, now they're saying this to each other. In my mind, I'm seeing them in the one part of the boat going, do you see what he just did? Who is this guy? What kind of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? These are fishermen. At least a handful of them are. And this doesn't happen. We've been on the sea when storms come, and we know this ain't normal. Who is this guy? So they witnessed what Jesus did. They were amazed. And that word literally meant, this is interesting to me. The word literally means, from what country? So in essence, what they're saying is where is this guy from? Where did he come from? And again, they don't fully understand. He is the Son of God. He became a man, but he's from heaven. That's where he's from. But again, they just don't understand at this time. But what Matthew wants is for the Jewish people to understand where this guy came from. Just like those Jewish men in that boat, they needed to understand where Jesus came from, and eventually they would understand. But at this point, they're just not getting it. And here's the reality. They hadn't seen the last of his power yet. As Matthew continues, they marveled and they wondered where Jesus came. They didn't understand who he was. But as Matthew continues, they get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and then they encounter the demoniacs. These two men. Verse 28, it continues. When he came to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him, and they were coming out of the tombs. They were so exceedingly violent that no one could pass by that way. Now, if you were to look at a map of the Sea of Galilee, the country of the Gadarenes was southeast of the Sea of Galilee. This is a Gentile area. I got to think in my mind, why did Jesus leave the crowds of Jewish people that were following him, cross the Sea of Galilee to go into a Gentile area? And the thing that comes to my mind is he wanted a break. He wanted a break from all the crowds. I mean, we saw how exhausted he was in the boat. He just wants a little time off, to relax, maybe to teach his disciples something. Well, let me tell you something. He's going to teach them something real important here in just a few moments as they go into this country. Now, what's interesting is Mark and Luke's gospel also record this event. But here's the thing that people often like to point out. They only mention one guy. And so people will key on that and they'll say, see that? A contradiction in the Bible. It's just not, well, Matthew says there was two. Mark and Luke say there was one. How do you explain that? Well, actually, it's rather very easy. Let me give you an example. Vicki and I go to the post office. And while we're at the post office, you and a friend come to the post office as well. And we see each other, we chit-chat for a while, and then we all go our separate ways. Later on, you meet someone and you say, I saw Mark and Vicki at the post office. Is that correct? Absolutely, it's correct. However, your friend meets somebody and says, well, I saw Vicki at the post office. Does that mean that Mark wasn't there? No, it doesn't. Does that mean someone's lying? No, it doesn't. Does that mean there's a contradiction? No, it doesn't. It means that the person that talked to Vicki was focusing on, or about Vicki, was focusing on Vicki. And I can see why they would do that. Whereas the other person said, oh yeah, Mark was with Vicki. And that's how it would be. It's not a contradiction. It's just focusing on different things. So Matthew says there were two. Luke and Mark say they're one, not a contradiction. Just different information that is being given. Verses 29 through 31. And when they cried out, saying, what business do you have with each other? What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Notice how they identify him. Have you come here to torment us before the time? Now, there was a herd of many swine feeding at a distance from them. Excuse me. the demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you are going to cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." So, the disciples just watched Jesus calm the storm. They get on land, they go over to this place, and the demon-possessed men called Jesus Son of God. The disciples weren't really sure. They did not know who Jesus really was. But the demons knew. The demons knew exactly who he was. In verse 32 it continues. And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the swine, and the whole herd rushed down a steep bank into the sea and perished in the water. Now that's some intelligent animals. I've heard that swine are very, very intelligent, and to me that's just a clue that they really are. They figured they were better off dead than having the demons indwelling them. Smart pigs. But can you imagine this? I mean, I can't even picture this in my mind, what this would be like. I mean, first of all, the Jews wanted nothing to do with the pigs, so maybe when the pigs jumped off into the water, they're like, "Yeah!" But this is just had to kind of freak them out. The disciples witnessed Jesus' power over the demons. And that had to be really kind of freaky for them. And again, they're probably thinking in their mind, who is this? Who is this? Verse 33 continues. They weren't the only ones that were amazed. The herdsmen ran away and went to the city and reported everything, including what happened to the demoniacs. So Jesus and the disciples were not alone. The pig herdsmen witnessed everything, and what did they do? They ran away, and they reported everything to the city. And you know what? Realistically, they might have been upset because of their financial loss that they just experienced. I mean, wouldn't you be a little ticked off if your whole herd just killed themselves in the ocean because this guy cast a bunch of demons into them? They were like, "Hey, thanks, but no thanks. You didn't do us any favors. And by the way, who are you? What kind of Jewish man are you? We've never seen anything like this at all." Or simply because of Jesus' display of power, they were actually afraid of him. So they went into the city and they told everybody about it. And verse 34 says, "And the whole city came out to meet Jesus." Not in a positive way. They were afraid. And when they saw him, they implored him to leave the region. Go away. They had no idea who Jesus was or what his motives might be. After all, they were Gentiles. These men were Jewish, and they knew that the Jewish people didn't have warm, fuzzy feelings for the Gentiles. And so they just simply asked him to leave, and that's what he did. But here's what I want you to see in this. What I want you to see is, as Matthew is bringing this out, as I've mentioned, he emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. He fell asleep. He got tired. But I also want you to see the deity of Jesus, because he calmed the storm, completely calm. And then he did something that nobody has ever done in addition to that. So he's already demonstrated his power over nature. He's already demonstrated his power over sickness and disease. Now he demonstrates as God his power over demons, fallen angels. And the Jewish people needed to understand who Jesus was. And the interesting thing is, these disciples that are in the boat with him, who would later become apostles, now they're beginning to understand, as they witness the things that Jesus does, exactly who he is. And they would eventually know that he went to the cross, he paid the price for their sins, and then a greater miracle, he rose from the dead. And Matthew wants his Jewish audience to understand it. And we need to understand these things as well, because we need to understand who Jesus is. Let's pray.